In ministry, you're going to use the word all the time, which means you have to understand the word. And interestingly, sometimes we don't really know the story of the Bible. It's 66 books and we know individual stories, we know some parables, but we simply don't know the story. We don't know how Elijah fits with King David or Esther, how the different pieces fit together. And in this Pillars session, we just want to take time and tell a story. Tell the story of this book so that as you study it and as you teach it, you understand the bigger story, because it's a selective story. God inspired people to write this story. This story has different stages to it. It begins at the beginning, which isn't actually accurate because there is a part of the story of God that is before creation. But in Genesis 1, there is this creation process that takes place. And the first season of beginnings, it's the start of many things, not just creation. It's the start of life. And Genesis talks about the beginning of life from the perspective of human beings, a man and a woman being created in God's image. It's the beginning of sin, where they face a temptation that we all face, and they experience a fall, and there is a penalty that takes place, and they are thrown out of the Garden of Eden, which in many ways was God's goodness and grace from the very beginning, because if they lived in the garden and they had sin and then they tried to eat from the tree of life, they would live in a permanent state of sin. So even though they're kicked out of the garden, it's the beginning of God's redemptive story. There's a story of a flood in Genesis. This is the beginning of the story of man's nature, and it illustrates how evil man is in his heart and God's love and God's mercy for restoration and redemption. It's the beginning of nations. There's a story of the Tower of Babel where they're all one people and God has given them this directive to multiply and spread out. But they build a tower and they say, no, let's make a name for ourselves. And they disobey God, and God comes down and disperses them, fulfilling his purpose, fulfilling his plan. The beginnings, this first stage, like the first 11 chapters of Genesis, it sets the rest of the Bible up. God has created us. He has shown his goodness to us. He wants to be in a relationship to us, but we have walked away and we have turned away from him. And yet in the beginnings, the first 11 chapters, you have the message of the gospel. In Genesis 3, you have the seed. You have God wanting to dwell with us. You have all the nations of the earth that God is working with. It is the beginnings. But from there, God takes the large group and now he narrows it down to one nation that he's going to work in his plan. And it begins with the story of Abraham. And this is the stage that deals with the founding fathers of the Israelite nation: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Abraham receives the covenant. He is known throughout the New Testament and gives an illustration of faith. Romans 4 talks about he received a righteousness by faith. He was God's friend, and Abraham is a picture of God starting to work through one nation for all of our salvation, but describing the relationship we can have from him. Abraham had a son named Isaac, and Isaac is there to show how the blessing is being passed on. That Isaac wasn't the most stellar person, but God's faithfulness is there. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob's story is one of a transformation of identity and God's patience with Jacob, like his God's patience with us. And then Jacob had sons, of which were the 12 tribes of Israel, and one of those sons was Joseph. And you begin to see the divine plan of God because there's a famine in the land. And now as he has 12 sons, God moves the whole tribe of Israel to Egypt because Joseph is sold into slavery. He ends up in Egypt, and you know the story towards the end of Genesis, where he gets elevated to a position of influence, and there's a famine. But Joseph, under the anointing of God, rescues not only Egypt, but he rescues his family. And now you have the Israelites, represented by one family, but 12 sons, who would be the 12 tribes, living in Egypt. And they're flourishing, and they're having a good life. This ends the book of Genesis. When you open the book of Exodus, it's a completely different story. 400 years have gone by, and now they're living in captivity. Now they're not just one family with 12 sons and children. Now there are millions of people completely in captivity. And God in his plan says, okay, now we're going to move into the Exodus. Still another insight into how God is moving us from captivity into deliverance in the promised land. And it is raising up this person by the name of Moses, who is called on by God to come and set the Israelites free. And the story talks about these 10 plagues that are brought by God. Every one of the plagues counteracted an Egyptian god. God is making this statement that he is the power and he is the authority and he will rule and he will have control over what's happening. But the most important one was the Passover, where it's a picture of Christ, where the Passover sacrifice could not have any blemish and had to die. And judgment would pass by the house and the house would be saved. And you have the Exodus of Israel. Now, when Moses leads the Israelites out of captivity, it's only a short journey, a matter of weeks to get to the promised land. But they don't go that way. God sends them down to Mount Sinai, where they camp for multiple months, because it's down in Mount Sinai that these band of millions of slaves become a nation. God sets up his law, the 10 Commandments that comes down. He sets up the government, how they're going to organize it. He sets up kind of their religion. Now they are poised to go into the promised land, and they travel up to the promised land, but it's here where they sin against God. This is the story where they send in just some spies, Joshua, Caleb, and a few others. And they all come back with the same report. The place is amazing. It's full of fruit and honey, and it's amazing, but there are these giants that are there. And most of the spies say, we cannot conquer. Joshua and Caleb said, with God's power, we can conquer. But the people follow the spies, and because of their disobedience, God then says, now you're going to wander in the wilderness for a generation, and a new generation will come over. So we have gone from the beginnings and the establishment of a nation of Israel in Egypt to their freedom with Moses, down to Mount Sinai, becoming a nation, entering to their wanderings in the wilderness because of their sin. Now they're positioned 40 years later, since their deliverance out of Egypt, to go into the promised land. And Joshua takes over. Now you have books like Joshua that are explaining what happens in this part of the story. Joshua leads the Israelites to conquer the promised land. The book of Joshua takes about 30 years of time. And you see there's a shift that happens in the Israelites. First they were in slavery, then they were wandering through the wilderness. But now they enter into the promised land and their life changes completely, because the promised land, the land of Canaan, it's got a different topography. There are mountains, and they settle as 12 tribes. But these 12 tribes are more isolated from each other. It's hard to have communication. It's hard to interact with each other. And they go from being one nation fully dependent upon God in the wilderness to more so being 12 tribes that are relying on themselves. They go from being weak in some ways in the wilderness to now being strong. They go from being wanderers to being farmers who are well established. And when they go into the promised land, they still disobey God, because the one command God gave Joshua was make sure you get rid of everybody who's in the promised land. All of the other nations, you have to conquer them. Because he knew that if those nations stayed, it would have a bad influence. And that's exactly what happened during this season that Joshua is settling into the promised land with the tribes. Spiritually, they change. They have this pagan influence of these nations that they didn't fully kick out. Politically, they don't have the same kind of rulership they had with Moses or with Joshua. And God now raises up what are called judges. There's actually a book in the Bible that illustrates these judges. And the role of a judge was to speak to one of the tribes or a couple of the tribes when they had kind of gone into this cycle. This is for 400 years this takes place. What would happen is a tribe would be living, they'd have some pagan influence, they would disobey God, and they would ultimately somehow be invaded by another nation. And they would cry out to God for help. And God would raise a judge like Deborah, Gideon, Ehud. You read about it in the book of Judges. And these judges would redeem and rescue the tribe, and they would restore them to a place of worship to God. But eventually, that tribe would disobey again. And you had this kind of cycle that went on and on and on for 400 years, and finally you get to a place where the nation comes together and they want a king. Now Israel shifts from 12 tribes to a single kingdom This is talked about in the book of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd, Samuel and Kings. The people ask Samuel, give us a king, because they wanted to be like all the other nations. And God responds, and there are 3 kings that God gives them. First Saul, then David, then Solomon. And all 3 kings reigned for about 40 years, but they're all distinct. Saul started well, but then he changed and pride took over. And he ended up committing suicide in a battle with the Philistines. David then took over from Saul, not Saul's children. And David was a man after God's heart. This was when Israel was politically and spiritually at their very best. This is when you have the most reflections of Christ. Then David, after 40 years, turned it over to Solomon, who had great wisdom and great worship, but ultimately the wealth and the waste ended up in his devastation as well. And here's what took place. You have during this time of the United Kingdom 3 kings, Saul, David, Solomon. And at the end of Solomon's reign, there's no one person to take over. And you end up going from a united kingdom to a divided kingdom over a civil war. And the civil war is over taxes. Not that much has changed. And Israel as one nation now becomes 2 nations. To the north, they're called Israel. There's about 10 tribes. To the south, they're called Judah. It's about 2 tribes. First, Israel. There's only 2 prophets that speak to them, Amos and Hosea. So what you have is kind of this cycle. The northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, people who disobey God, God raises up a prophet to speak to them, to remind them of what they're supposed to be doing, and they repent, but then they go into this cycle again. Eventually, the northern kingdom is conquered in 722 BC by a nation called Assyria, and their policy is to disperse everybody. And they just disperse everybody all over the place. And they intermarry. When you get to the New Testament, there's a region called Samaria. And the Jews and the Samaritans, they hate each other. Because Samaritans come from the Jewish northern kingdom people who stayed and intermarried with the other nations. So they're only partially Jewish. So the southern kingdom Jews see them as evil, but they still have some of the Jewish traces in them. You have the southern kingdom. They are not obliterated. They get captured as well by a nation called Babylon in 586, and they're taken into captivity. There's about these two tribes that were taken into captivity. Many of the prophets spoke during this time. So when you read Joel or Isaiah or Micah or Jeremiah, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, all of them are speaking to the southern kingdom. The reason why this is important to understand is during this period of time, you had kings and you had prophets. And the Bible, Old Testament, is full of how the prophets are speaking. A few to the northern kingdom, many to the southern kingdom in their situation. And you have this kind of divided kingdom. The northern kingdom is dispersed, the southern kingdom taken into captivity. When they're in captivity, they enter into this special season because they are going from being a holy nation. They had Jerusalem, they had the temple, it's all destroyed. Now they're in exile, and there is a shift that happens in the nation of Israel. They go from shifting and putting a greater emphasis on God's law because there is no more king and there is no more temple. And God is setting things up for Christ. That's why the prophets who spoke during their captivity time, like Ezekiel and Daniel, are forecasting Christ and what's going to happen. They live in captivity for 70 years. And then under the leadership of Nehemiah and Ezra, they're allowed to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the city and the walls and even the temple. And that's what Nehemiah and Ezra is all about, the return that comes in to rebuilding the nation. And now they are waiting for the Messiah. So think of this. This is the Old Testament story. From the very beginnings to the nation of Israel by one family, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, to a family living in Egypt under captivity. 400 years later, Moses setting them free, walking through the wilderness, setting up as a nation, but sinning against God for wandering the wilderness for 40 years. Joshua leading them in, becoming tribes more than a nation until Saul, David, and Solomon unify them. But then a civil war splits them into the north and to the south. The north is obliterated. The south eventually goes into captivity. But after 70 years of captivity, they're allowed to come back and they rebuild the wall and they rebuild the temple. And this is where Malachi ends, and they're waiting for the Messiah. And when you open up the New Testament, 400 years have gone by and God has been silent. But now the story moves into a completely different dimension, because now we have the life of Christ. And it's a completely different world. Now it's Romans and Greeks. And Jesus' life is divided into 3 years reflected by the Gospels. Year 1, he has lots of miracles. Year 2, he has lots of teachings. Year 3 is his death. And it's important, even as you read the Gospels, to understand the big story that is there that gives it to us. Most of the Gospels deal with the final week. Like Mark, half of his book is on the final week, because that's the priority of the life of Christ. The life of Christ ends through the Gospels, and then you open up the book of Acts, and Acts, through the end of the New Testament, is about the church and building the church. They begin in Jerusalem, but then they spread out. God saves Paul, who leads the Gentile trips and the missions trips, and the world begins to know the gospel. The book of Acts records that as a kind of a history story. But as Paul and Peter and others would travel around and work in churches, problems would arise. And they would write letters to these churches addressing their spiritual problems. That's the letters of the New Testament. So understanding the story and why they're writing these letters helps us understand the content of that letters. And then you get to the last book. The last book is the book of Revelation. You see, we start at the beginnings in Genesis, and we walk through the Old Testament and the story of God forming a nation, and that nation rebelling against God, and us gaining insights into who God is and how he works with us and forming his plan. And then we wait for 400 years, and the Messiah shows up, and we learn about his life through the Gospels and what Christ has done. And then the church begins in the book of Acts. And as the church grows and encounters problems and questions, all these letters help us understand. But you get to the book of Revelation. If you had beginnings, the book of Revelation, it actually is another story of beginnings. Revelation is not about the end. It's actually about the start. Because the entire story of the Bible covers a time on earth. And the beginning for the book of Revelation covers a time of the final age, when Christians will live forever in glory and wonder and beauty with Christ. Here's what matters. Know the story, so that when you go to read certain books or even certain passages, you understand how it fits into the greater story, God's greater story of what he's doing. You understand what Esther is doing and what Elijah is doing and what's going on and what season they're in of the divided kingdom or the united kingdom. You understand the Gospels and how they're reflecting the life of Christ and point many times to the Old Testament. It's like the Old Testament stories illustrate the New Testament teachings that are there. When you know the story, as I've succinctly and kind of briefly shared it with you, you will have a much clearer understanding of how the stories and the truths fit into the greater story of God, and you will handle the Word of God with more effectiveness and more revelation. Know the story of the Bible.